average life expectancy was just 24. Thoughts of death would have dominated the minds of the inhabitants and would have terrified them. So, to try to reassure themselves, the Jerichoans created artistic representations of their dead.
The skulls from Jericho are just a striking example of the people of that time trying to keep their dead alive and to keep them present. And if they're still present, then they still exist, and thus they exist after death. And that's really what we're all looking for, and that would be the most comforting thing that would really assuage this potential terror.
What motivated the Jerichoans was a universal human instinct. The fear of our own death is so great, we surround ourselves with pictures of people who've already died in order to reassure ourselves. But reassurance is only part of the story, because there are other images of death that are very different. These seem to have the very opposite effect. Far from reassuring us, they exploit our fear of death and seem to make it worse. Take a look at this. This unsettling painting from the 18th century depicts a leader of the French Revolution who's been murdered, while this 19th century picture shows a massacre of Spanish civilians. This etching shows a hanging. And in the 20th century, Himmler's SS chose to use as its regimental symbol a skull and crossbones. Images of death like these aren't reassuring, they're upsetting, terrifying even. Why do human beings create images that are so deeply disturbing? What we need to find is a civilization that's taken images like these and pushed them to the limit. If we can understand what motivated them, then we might understand what motivates us. This is the coast of northern Peru in South America. Between 100 and 700 AD, a powerful civilization dominated this area. It was called the Moche. 10 years ago, an archaeologist came here to study the Moche. His name is Steve Bourget. Bourget began his excavations at the foot of this building, the Temple of the Moon, or Huaca de la Luna. It was built almost 2,000 years ago. Today, the images on its mud walls have faded and seem to have little significance. But this is what they would once have looked like. On these walls are some of the most grotesque images of death one can imagine. These, for instance, are spiders. But they are no ordinary spiders. Each one is carrying a knife. And on their backs, they have a human face with fangs. Here's a row of lizard beasts, all carrying a decapitated human head. And scattered around the site was Moche pottery, showing other disturbing acts.
these images look terrifying. For example, people being literally eaten alive by birds, having their face taken off, these crude facelift, and things like that.
What kind of dark mythology produced these images? Were they simply the product of a lurid, violent fantasy?
We see what appears to be supernatural beings, people with fangs, and so it looks unreal.
But there were no clues as to why the Moche had created such art. What had compelled them, Bourget wondered, to create such disturbing images of death? Then, one day, walking near the temple, he noticed something strange. It was a large rock formation. But what was so unusual was that it had an almost identical shape to the mountain behind it. Bourget began to wonder if that had given it a special significance.
I believe that there was a connection between this rock and the mountain behind it, but that this rock was in fact a sacred rock, a sacred outcrop. In fact, a copy, a small copy of the mountain behind it.
Bourget and his team began to excavate the area. What they found astonished them.
At the beginning, all we had there was sand, clay, rubbles, bricks, nothing else. So we start digging there, and a meter and a half inside this rubble, we located human remains.
Not just one skeleton, but 70. And these bodies hadn't died naturally.
As soon as we start encountering the very first human remains, we found, for example, a cranium with a large opening in the back of the head. We found another man resting on his back with a gash, a wound just alongside the head, just right there, probably made with a copper knife.
There was something else about these skeletons. Many of them weren't intact.
Okay, what we have there is a human cranium, and you can see that this head is literally standing alone. The body has been removed from the corpse itself. So it indicates that not only they killed people there, but also dismantled the corpses, so took them apart, so to speak.
Next to a prominent rock, people had been killed and their bodies had been dismembered. For Bourget, it could mean only one thing.
This rocky outcrop was in fact a sacred altar, in fact a sacred mountain, a small microcosm of the big mountain behind it. And in front of this altar, this would have been the best place for performing human sacrifice.
Bourget had discovered that this was a site of ritual sacrifice. But that was just the start, because then he noticed something else. Dismembering, skeletons, severed heads. These sacrificial remains bore a remarkable resemblance to many of the artistic images created by the Moche.
Indeed, what we're looking at is, these are perhaps in fact illustrations of sacrifice at the same time that they are the real thing, they're the real McCoy, so to speak.
Time and again, the Moche had performed horrific acts of sacrifice and then created images of it. This wasn't art as fantasy, it was art as documentary.